Hi, welcome to Civs 101. I'm your host, Bob Whitaker. On today's episode, we're considering India, led by Mahatma Gandhi. In a lot of ways, Gandhi is as synonymous with the Civilization series as Sid Meier himself. He's been in every version of the game, is the leader of one of the game's most unique civs, and thanks to a long-running myth about a bug in Civilization 1, is the basis for all sorts of memes connected with civilization and gaming more generally. But where does this depiction of Gandhi stand now with Civilization 6? And is there any argument to be made about introducing a new leader for the India Civ? To help me consider these questions and others, I've invited onto the show Dr. Amber Abbas, who is an associate professor of history at St. Joseph's University. Her research focuses on modern India, the partition of 1947, and the impact of independence and partition on South Asian Muslims. She is the author of Partition's First Generation: Space, Place, and Identity in Muslim South Asia, published by IB Tauris in 2021. Amber, welcome to Civs 101.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
It's good to have you. So India is one of the original 14 civs in the Civilization series, and Gandhi himself has been the primary leader for this civilization since 1991. It makes me feel very old. So this fixation on Gandhi by Sid Meier's Civilization and by the series in general, it's one it's mirrored by other Western historical fictions, including books, historical movies, historical TV shows. And so I'm wondering, given the long history of India and the history of the subcontinent more generally, why do you think it is that Gandhi has come to dominate the Western view of India's past?
That's a great question. I think, one of the challenges of speaking and thinking and studying about India is its immense complexity. India's civilization is one of the oldest on the planet. There were complex cities in the subcontinent in 2500 BCE. And because of its location in the center of Eurasia, India has also been a crossroads of civilizations since the oldest recorded histories of the region. Mm-hmm. And to delve in any meaningful way into that complexity gets you into some very complicated places very quickly, right? Because there's no singular story of India. And I think one of the appealing aspects of looking at Gandhi and his legacy is that it can be understood within a sort of modern lens of aspiration to freedom, liberation from oppression, and also the sort of self-determinacy that I think is very familiar to at least American learners. Mm-hmm. That means that even though India is distant from the US, it's distant from our minds and our territory, it has all this incredible complexity. We find a figure in Gandhi that we can relate to because he shares some of the aspirations that we have come to understand as part of American history and especially not least the parallels in the struggle for freedom from empire from the same imperial power, obviously, mm-hmm. in two different times, but that creates a sort of meaningful connection between the lives that we're leading here and the way we understand our own history and the lives that people have led in India and the way that we might understand theirs. And so I think that makes Gandhi very appealing, and yet his story is so distinct from anything that appears in U.S. history, mm-hmm. That he is sort of fascinating in his difference, in that the different approach that he offers to anti-colonial nationalism, and maybe we're interested in that difference, and certainly the game is interested in that difference. I mean,
Yes.
if we look at the way I understand him being represented within the game, he's represented in contrast to the vast majority of other leaders, in his insistence on pacifism or a sort of anti-military or anti-war stance. One of the curious things that I found when I was researching the way he's portrayed in the game is I watched one of the trailers and they talked about Gandhi's empire. And I thought, I can understand the way, like, maybe that concept of empire is used within the game. But, I think Gandhi would find that representation quite curious.
Yeah. And so, one of the kind of common criticisms of the Civilization series is it is, it's telling the history of the world from a Western lens, and it's also telling the history of the world from an imperial lens. And that imperial lens tends to be somewhat celebratory. You might say outright celebratory. And I think, you're dead on there. When you talk about Gandhi and how he's treated by the game, he is treated as an outsider, and he is treated as kind of a lone alternative path to victory that doesn't involve conquest and territorial possession. But at the same time, like you said, from the trailer, it talks about Gandhi's empire and the Indian empire. And so this is a game that's very steeped in the mechanics and psychology of imperialism. And so, yeah, it's very, very odd to have, Gandhi, somebody who, like you said in your introduction, somebody who's synonymous with imperial resistance and resistance against the great empire, the British Empire, in modern history, to have him as an emperor in this game. It's very, very odd.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I say, I can understand it as in sort of the mechanics of the game, but it also then makes me think he's sort of a curious choice to be that leader. One of the things that we were looking at one of the things I noticed when I was doing my research was the presence, and I don't want to get too far ahead, but you had flagged for me that there is this sort of alternative leader of Chandragupta Maurya, who is an ancient leader of India in the deep pre-modern past. And his grandson, Ashoka, is the other Indian leader. So the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya is Ashoka, who is remembered in Indian history for his pacifism. So it's actually not the case that Gandhi represents the only possible alternative to conquest in terms of leadership within India. But I think one of the potential problems that Ashoka may have presented to the way India is constructed, as I understand it in the game, is that Ashoka was not a Hindu. And much of the representation of what it means to be Indian in the sort of background entries for the game talks about Hinduism, or represents Hinduism as sort of the fundamental, authentic Indian religious identity. And while India has a number of religions that started in India, it also, as I mentioned, has been an incredible crossroads of languages and faiths and traditions since the dawn of civilization in the region. So Ashoka may present a sort of problem of reconciliation within an idea of a kind of straightforward trajectory that relies upon Hinduism as as fundamental to Indian identity. And I think that presents a problem for some modern Indians in sort of navigating Ashoka's legacy as well. But in that sense, because that other example exists within the Indian past, it sort of additionally presents Gandhi as a curiosity. And I don't have a sense of which other leaders within the game are from the 20th century. Are there others?
Yeah, so let's take a moment and look at that. And let's see where I can go and look at this. Leaders, I think. Yeah, leaders here. So you've got a list here, and unfortunately, we would just have to click through all of them to confirm some of their identities. But you can see here, like Frederick Barbarossa, for Germany. And we had done an episode of Civs 101 on Barbarossa. So, we've got this medieval leader who represents a modern state, Germany. But he is coming from an era where Germany itself didn't exist, right? You could say the German people existed, but Germany itself didn't exist. And so he's kind of a newer leader. But then in other cases, we've got, let me come down here. We've got Teddy Roosevelt representing America. And so modern leader, modern idea of America, but then the idea of America itself as a civilization that goes back into the ancient era is very humorous and very ridiculous. Sure. And so it's kind of like, if you were to take from a Western perspective, from a North American perspective, who is the historical figure that is kind of the poster child for whatever civilization you're looking at? Say maybe the historical figure that you would find in the first page of a children's encyclopedia at an elementary school. That's the type of figure that's typically used as the leader for a civilization. And so in the case of, Gandhi in India, it makes a lot of sense, but particularly from a North American point of view where, those players, they want to feel as though they have some sort of mastery over the history as well as the mastery over the game. And so to complicate that history, I think with, like you were suggesting, a non-Hindu leader or non-modern leader, that would, I think, be a little bit upsetting to them.
Sure. Well, and it's interesting, too, to think about, Gandhi as a modern leader. But a big part of his philosophy, his outlook on empire, was actually anti-industrial. So to transpose him, to both imagine him as a modern leader with a set of modern politics that encountered conflict with the sort of industrial notion, the industrial capacity of the empire itself. In the game, he's allowed then to take his what he might have said was sort of anti-modernity, back into an earlier period. Does that make sense?
Yes.
So that's a sort of fascinating possibility, which is who might Gandhi have been in another time and place, which of course, as historians, these counterfactuals are sometimes fun to explore, but because his politics are so much the politics of the 19th and 20th centuries, it's kind of fascinating to imagine how the sort of fundamental ideas. I noticed that the game uses the idea of Dharma as the sort of, I forget what it's called, it's like the tool or the advantage or something. What's the phrase that it uses for Dharma? Oh, your unique ability.
Yes,
thank you.
Unique ability. That's
your
it.
Unique ability is Dharma. And, for Gandhi, Dharma was duty. So on one hand, he gets this idea from the sacred texts of Hinduism about how individuals are to perform their roles in society. So in his philosophy and his political philosophy, he sort of marries these ideas that come from his faith and from some of the foundational texts of his faith with a sort of modern politics. In that sense, I think that he is appealing as a leader who can move through time.
Yeah, that's interesting. He, in some respects, feels kind of timeless. Whereas I think some of these other leaders, we could see over here on the left, a bit harder to make that same argument. I always just point to Teddy Roosevelt in that regard, because it's still just so funny to me to have him representing America, but then also, having the idea of an American civilization that is, right next to Cleopatra, or to Dido, or to Alexander, right? Or for that matter, having Alexander in the modern age, right? How does that make sense? And yet that's something that this game does all the time. And, I think it's funny, talking a bit more about the history of the game itself, when the series started, when you were picking a civilization, you would pick it based on what nationality you wanted. So original Civs included America, included England, included France, included India. But in more recent versions of the game, from say like Civilization 5, Civilization 6, you now pick your character based on which leader you want to play as. And so, the character selection screen is the first thing you see. It's not their country of origin or their civilization. It's the character. And so it's much more focused on what I'd say was kind of the personal level of, choosing a historical avatar. And so I think in that respect, Gandhi, like you had mentioned previously, is kind of an aspirational figure, right? He's kind of a way for the player character to embody this role, not only as somebody who's deeply religious, but then also somebody who represents kind of high ideals, at least in the Western imagination, high ideals related to anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, and self-determination.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm sort of thinking through that because I'm fascinated by the idea that a game called Civilizations was so focused on national identity. An idea of being associated with a nation or a nation state, which is of course a very 19th and 20th century concept in a sense. And I think what Gandhi gives then is that same kind of transition from thinking about an ancient civilization that is complex and diverse and not defined by fixed boundaries to one that is in a process of construction. A lot of what Gandhi was talking about was like, how do we make a state that encompasses the diversity that already exists here? And he didn't believe that it had to be formed through war and conquest, but it was also partly those strategies were also an outcome of the power differential between Indians as colonized peoples and the massive power of the British Empire. Now, of course, we know that much of the massive military power of the British Empire was in fact Indian soldiers and Indian bodies, but they were operating in support of empire or in service of empire. And for Gandhi, he had to find a strategy that would shift those allegiances by mobilizing people for something else to resist the empire. And so it is sort of appealing to think of him within the context of the game then as somebody who's really navigating those tensions between ancient civilization that has different parameters and the formation of a kind of national entity, nation state. And so the game seems like it's almost gone in the opposite direction, where from a focus on national identity to a focus on sort of the how of building that context, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no.
So, of course, from someone who hasn't played the game, but just from learning about it from you, that's what I'm hearing.
No, that's great. And this is why I really liked having people who have no familiarity with this game to come on here, because they point out things that I don't really see, because I've been playing this game for 30 years. And so, I can't really often see the forest for the trees. And so, that kind of perspective is really, really useful. And I think it's really useful for our listeners too. So let's stop talking about Gandhi for a second. And, we've got this focus on Gandhi, on modern India that's presented by this game. But I'm wondering, as a scholar, given this kind of general focus in historical fiction, independent of this game and in this game, do you worry that the public in all of this history, they're missing out on crucial elements of India's past, especially with regard to the history of India's independence and partition?
In a word, yes. So there are a couple of things that that I notice in the representation of India within the game that I think mirror some of the broader perceptions that people have in their relationship to Indian history or their understanding of Indian history, to the extent that it even exists. I've spent a little bit of time, looking at say high school or middle school textbooks, and to try to understand how Indian history is represented. And it may come as no surprise that how Indian history is represented is actually very much a topic of debate within the world of textbook creation and sort of the people who are creating knowledge about India. But sometimes there's a paragraph, on a time period that doesn't get into too much detail. What they do tend to talk about is India as a Hindu civilization. Hinduism is represented as being fundamental to Indian identity when, in fact, even the concept of Hinduism is a very sort of modern label for a complex interaction of a whole host of beliefs and practices that exist within the subcontinent. So if we think of Hinduism as sort of Indian religion, there are some similarities geographically and chronologically throughout the time that India has existed and the territories that it inhabits, but there's also no single set of beliefs or practices that actually unify all of that complexity. And something I often tell my students about India is that nothing ever goes away in India. So anything that comes to India, if it stays long enough, and that would include languages, that would include migrants, migrations of people, it would include faith traditions, it would include, goods that come in from outside or crops. Everything becomes Indian if it stays in India for very long. And it just becomes a part of what it means to be Indian. So to me, one of the things I see in the game is the sort of excision of, for instance, the history of Muslims and Muslim leadership in India as being Indian. So Muslim rulers governed and dominated parts of India from as early as 1205 CE until as late as 1857 CE, depending on how you count, what you're looking at, what you consider power. So the sort of biggest span is typically considered that 650 or so years. And so Muslims get mentioned in the encyclopedia entries here, but they don't feature, no Muslims feature in the naming of the characters as far as I could tell, or the representation of any of the leadership that appears in India in the game. And that is a really crucial oversight, because if we consider the contribution of Muslim empires in India to simply to have been architectural, then we are losing a huge part of how Indian administration, Indian governance, Indian values came to be formed through the interaction, not just of Hindus and Muslims, or who we might call Hindus and who we might call Muslims, but also the ways in which, but also Christians who come in with the British, or even Syrian Christians who come in from Arabia, across the Arabian Sea much, much earlier, Buddhists, the history of Buddhism in India. So when we reduce Indian identity to that sort of single valence, or we reduce Muslim experience in India to conquest and architecture, we always, like, Muslims were there, they built the Taj Mahal. Great. But they did a lot of other things too. And what they did and how they factored in Indian society actually is quite significant to the ways in which anti-colonial nationalism developed. And of course, the way the subcontinent was apportioned after the end of the empire in 1947. So I can't remember now exactly what the question was, but what are we missing? I think what we're missing is the fact that to be Indian is more than one thing, and that everything becomes Indian if it stays there long enough. So we should be very wary of considering Muslims outsiders or Muslims as conquerors in India. And the reason that this matters ultimately for me as a scholar, and I think for Americans, is because these questions of who belongs in India and whose stories can be made visible in Indian history are still being worked out among Indians in India today.
Yeah.
And so the extent to which we as scholars, or even we as game makers, representing Indian history and civilization in ways that repeat the dominant narratives, when those dominant narratives are being used to abuse and marginalize Muslims in the world that we live in every day, I think is potentially a very significant problem.
Yeah. And
I know why it happened, but I think we should be very careful about it.
Yeah. And, I think you make a great point there at the end of, this kind of dominant narrative and how much that was kind of constructed by the British, when they were in control of the subcontinent. And you got vestiges here of that kind of British imperial perspective on Indian history, right? Like the first paragraph brings up the British East India Company. And then as far as kind of diversifying India history, this is a encyclopedia entry from the Civilopedia that doesn't mention Muslim leaders, but does have space to mention Lord Curzon. Right. I mean,
Sure.
That's a red flag for me as a historian with a PhD in British imperial history. This is kind of, a vestige of that narrative that, I don't think the game makers are really aware of, but these kinds of entries, this kind of perspective, even though it is historical fiction, even though it is just a game, these kinds of depictions do matter, right? They do have an influence on how people perceive the past, right? Not everybody is sitting around reading books written by historians. If they were, we would be doing much better. But
well, maybe so, maybe not. I mean, historians have created this narrative,
yes.
Right? So I think one of two things I want to say before you move away from this particular paragraph, which is something we were discussing earlier, is the way that this paragraph ends. The final sentence that says, the British had laid the foundation for a nationalist movement, especially among the relatively new Indian middle class, of which Gandhi was a member. And then the paragraph ends with "oops," which sort of betrays the perspective, the British imperial foundation of this entry, that this was somehow an error that the British made in their role in the 19th and 20th century, which also suggests that either the empire was sort of operating in the sort of classic notion of in a fit of absence of mind, or that actually the independence of colonized peoples is somehow an inversion of a true historical trajectory, right? If Indian independence is the outcome of a mistake made by the British, it undermines the notion of the agency of Indians to secure their own freedom and independence. And if we think about it that way, then Gandhi's role as the leader is even more curious, because he is then the outcome of this error, this mistake that was created by empire, rather than an independent agent on his own terms. And I think the other question about who gets represented even in these encyclopedia entries is a bigger problem in the representation of Indian history, and I think this is what your question was getting at. If a lot of people learn about Indian history from the movie, Gandhi,
Yeah.
which in many ways is a very fine movie. I grew up with it, in a Pakistani American household. It was a movie we were always allowed to watch. But when we look at it closely, for instance, we can see the ways that the British narrative of Indian history is very well represented there, but also the way the sort of Indian version, and when I say India now, I mean like the Indian state, the post-1947 Indian state version is well represented. Because if we're thinking about the politics of partition and independence, and that's really where my expertise lies, one of the things that I have done is tried to draw out the role and history of Muslims and Muslim leadership in that anti-colonial activism. And shockingly, Muslim people figure very rarely, even in the ways that historians have written about partition and independence.
Yes.
And my intervention there was to go to India, to go to Pakistan, to go to Bangladesh, and interview people who were active in the movement for the independence of Pakistan when they were young, when they were students, and to talk to them about what did they want, what did they expect, how do they now, at that time, 50 or 60 years on after independence, reflect on their role, on their actions, and on the outcomes of 1947. And Muslims have been constructed in the anti-colonial movement as the other of Indian nationalism. They cannot just be nationalists. They're always Muslim nationalists.
Yes.
But Muslim nationalism has a very different valence. They cannot be nationalists who are Muslims. If they are Muslims, they are read as Muslim nationalists. But many of the people that I interviewed did not experience their enthusiasm for anti-colonial activism in that way. They didn't necessarily see themselves as Muslim nationalists. And some of them came to support for Pakistan quite late. Some of them, in fact, were nationalists who are Muslims. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, as the leader of the Muslim League, and therefore the leader of the movement that ultimately led to the creation of Pakistan, is always presented in Indian history and, in fact, in the movie Gandhi as a villain. Mm-hmm. Even the way he's physically represented and portrayed in the film, he's very sharp-nosed, he's very prickly, he doesn't want to interact with anybody, he sits in a room and he's just cold as ice.
Yeah.
But there's another piece there, which is that B.R. Ambedkar, who was the leader of India's lowest status people, the Dalits of India, doesn't even have a cameo in the movie Gandhi. He doesn't appear at all.
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that Gandhi had more than one opponent, right? Jinnah was not the only anti-colonial nationalist who was skeptical of Gandhi's objectives. Ambedkar was a very prominent opponent. And that is a piece of the telling of Indian history which has been all but buried.
Yeah.
Except for in the movements of Dalit people for their own liberation from the hierarchies of caste that continue to dominate in Indian society. So when we think about who has been rendered absent in our understandings of Indian history, those two groups, for me, are the ones that stand out the most distinctly, as having stories to tell that are incredibly vital to the progress of Indian history and civilization, but who never make it into the final version.
Yeah.
They never make the final cut.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's such a great point to bring up Attenborough's Gandhi, because I do think it has a really powerful influence, or it has a powerful influence on its own, but it also is representative of the way that story has been told since 1947. Mm-hmm. And I did we're in the midst of the pandemic, and so there's been a lot of virtual learning going on, and we have a film series on campus, and we did one last year in which we looked at films and the way they portray heroes. And so I got to lead the campus-wide discussion of the film Gandhi, of Attenborough's Gandhi. And students were surprised to find me in the discussion sections talking about Muslims so much, right? Sure. You know, where is this story? And in that discussion section, I talked about how Jinnah is portrayed, and I referred to him as he's a bit like a James Bond villain in this movie. You know, the way he dresses, the way he acts, the way he looks. He's a threat throughout this otherwise story of, heroism, of Gandhi's triumph over his, not only enemies abroad, the British Empire, but then also opponents at home. So I think what we see here in the Civilopedia is kind of replicating a lot of that narrative. Maybe not on purpose, obviously, but it's kind of representative. And, I think if we can think of Attenborough's film as being influential on our perception of the past, then we definitely need to consider games like Civilization as contributing to that as well.
Yes. I mean, I think, I also teach a class called Islam in Asia. And because, of course, Islam is all throughout Asia, not just in what we now call the Middle East, and has long since emerged from the Arabian Peninsula and is deeply entrenched in India and Southeast Asia, China. There are Muslims in Japan and Thailand. So it's a wonderful class to be able to teach, to explore some of those specific histories throughout Asia. But one of the first questions I ask my students is, what do you know about Muslims, and where did you learn it? And I always have students cite their video games because I don't know, maybe Call of Duty is the one I think that they represent or that they mention, and in which Muslims are always presented as enemies, as villains, as terrorists. And so, again, I don't know the game specifically, but I do know that we learn from our media, whether that is whatever that media may be, our children's books and the ways in which they may or may not represent people whose heritage and background is different from the ones within our own families, or it's our video games or our television shows. So the movies we see, this is not a new argument I'm making, but representation matters, and the nature of representation matters. Who's doing the writing will change the outcomes of what is written and what is represented. And so I don't know anything about the creators of this game. And I think in a lot of ways, reading through these entries, they're on the face of them quite informative. They don't have any glaring errors, right? They're historically accurate, and that is important because that's not guaranteed in all of these sort of popular spaces that represent history.
Definitely.
But the nature of this medium perhaps is reductive in a way.
Yeah.
And this may not be the space for investigating all that complexity, but it's fun to get to think about what other possibilities there might be, or how we might use this as a launching point for understanding more about this history.
Yeah. Well, that's a nice segue to the next question. And, thinking about other possibilities, if you could advise the developers of Civilization on choosing a new leader for the India Civ, who would you choose and why?
That's a really hard question, Bob.
Look, this is a serious show. This is a serious show. We ask the tough questions. We put historians on the spot. No squirming away. Give me your answer right now.
Right now. So my answer, I think, is very bad.
Okay.
Because I would actually The only alternative I could think of was Nehru. And I think that is a bad answer for some of the same reasons that we think Gandhi is a suspect choice, right? Which is that Nehru very much embodies the values of 20th century modernity and secularism and a rational tradition. But he also was very attentive to the ways in which, in that context, India's complexity could be leveraged as a strength. And I think that one of the things that Nehru did well was to use his context, the context of Asia, the actual context of India, as a factor for drawing disparate groups of people together around common causes, to imagine versions of power and leadership that were not entirely rooted in the relationship to empires or the immediate past empires, right? But then I sort of checked myself and I thought, okay, like, well, what do we want? What do we think then about a game that represents historical civilizations? And why am I reaching for a 20th century leader? Nehru, was also not perfect. So then I thought about the Mughal Emperor Akbar. And Akbar similarly was known for his efforts at assimilating and drawing into his governance and even his concepts of religion, the many traditions of India, whether that was the Zoroastrian or the Persian traditions, the Jains, the Sunni Muslims and the Shia Muslims, but also the Jesuits. He invited the Jesuits to come to his court, and he would hold these gatherings, multi-religious, or what we might now call interreligious gatherings. And his goal from them was not necessarily to walk away with a steady determination that his faith in Islam was the best, but that he seemed to have taken seriously the possible legitimacy of other paths. And so I like that possibility, that you and Akbar was an Indian leader. He did not have his sights set on other places. He wasn't going back anywhere. And so despite his Muslimness and his heritage in the Mongol lineages and Turco-Persian lineages, he was firmly Indian. And some of those approaches to understanding India's complexity, I think, remain meaningful. The problem, of course, with Akbar is that he has now been configured as an enemy of Indian history, because of the nature of Hindu first politics in modern India. So I think it's unlikely that the game could get away with using him as the sort of leader of India without there being some significant outcry or protest.
Right. And and I would say with regards to the developers, I think they are, they show it in the Civilopedia entries here. They do have an interest in history. The players have an expectation that there is some historical grounding to this game, but at the same time, they like to keep the history in these games within the realm of popular expectations. And so, like, I think, like you were saying, if they were to step out of those boundaries, there could be repercussions. There could be some players who are upset, and they would be very vocal about it. And, it is a game that's developed by primarily North American developers. Firaxis is based outside of Washington, D.C. And so I think for players in North America, they might not, get into all of these issues related to, historical politics in India itself. But, this is a global game. This is a game that's played all around the world. And so they're trying to meet the expectations of multiple audiences at once.
Sure. And I would add, I mean, the representations of Muslims in American society have firmly and consistently vilified Muslims. So it's unlikely that that Emperor Akbar would be very appealing. That's
a great point. Yeah.
In pushing back against those expectations for an American audience, right?
Yeah.
But I think that may also be why Akbar could be a good choice, is because he represents a version of Muslim leadership that would likely be very unfamiliar within our accepted stereotypes of who Muslims are and what they want.
Mm-hmm.
So Firaxis, if you're listening.
Of course, we're in constant contact. So last question here, and this is another difficult question, but I'm going to ask it anyways. So this is a game that's built around the development and progress of civilizations. And the idea of studying civilizations, it harkens back to a very different era of historical study based around arbitrarily constructed groups of people, usually living in the ancient era, or the history starting in the ancient era. And so given that, what do you make of the idea of an Indian civilization in this game?
I mean, I think that the only problem I guess I have with it is the notion of singularity.
Mm-hmm.
Because India's history of settlement in the region is very old, and there were complex cities with indoor plumbing and multi-story houses dating as early as 25 BCE. But we can't connect those civilizations historically in the record directly to the civilizations that followed them,
mm-hmm.
that are more explicitly within what we might think of as a Hindu tradition, using the same text, the same norms. So there is a gap in the record, but we know that there have been complex societies within the region for a very long time. And so I think the thing that's kind of funny is that the British had a hard time accepting the notion that India was civilized,
mm-hmm.
right, within their framing. But the notion of civilizations interacting with one another, contesting for territorial and ideological control, it has a deep and rich history. I mean, even if we look at the use of Chandragupta Maurya in the game, Chandragupta was known for having been associated with the Arthashastra, with this manual of political diplomacy that has India has a very rich tradition of literature around guidance for kings and leadership, and some of that comes from the Turco-Persian tradition and the manuals for kings, and some of it comes from within India, but they mix together and become valuable. So India's, as I was kind of saying before, even when we look at the origins of the British Empire in India, and you'll know this better than I do, perhaps, the British built upon existing administrative norms and structures.
Yeah.
So I think that if we take the concept of civilization as being a definition of organized polities, then I think it can be quite meaningful in India, as long as we don't think of it as something that no longer exists.
Mm-hmm.
So like civilization, a thing of the past, nation state, a thing of the present. That's kind of the interesting thing about taking a 20th century leader and allowing him to be transposed into this past, is that civilization requires organization. And so I think I've kind of lost my train of thought, but I think that allowing a 20th century leader to be present in the past lends some credibility to the notion that there is or was something civilized in India.
Yeah.
which does sort of push back against those British ideas.
Yes.
That in order for India to become civilized, they had to become modern, they had to become British within a sort of, rational utilitarian tradition.
Yes. And, I think from my own perspective and having played this game for a long time, I think what annoys me about the use of the phrase civilization or the word civilization is that in a lot of these cases, and you can see the list of civs over here on the left, in a lot of these cases, particularly with the Greeks or the Romans, is using the phrase civilization, using the word civilizations, it is something that connotates immutability and a lack of influence from outside sources, which, I think as scholars, we would know that that's not true, right? Greeks, Romans, even these old societies, Egyptian civilization, heavily influenced by other groups that maybe don't get their own section in the textbook, but are still really important and influential. And I think that idea, when applied to India, is interesting because, like you said, India is one of these places where it is the crossroads of so many different cultural ideas, philosophical ideas, religious ideas, groups of people. And so I feel like it has, in a Western point of view, it has a more difficult time applying that same sort of immutable idea of civilization. And yet I think that the way that you've outlined it just now, and, how that kind of idea of civilization, when applied to India, can allow for these other groups, if you perhaps try a different perspective or try a different leadership, maybe, I would almost want the developers to restart, if they were to do Civilization 7, which I'm sure they will, to start from the ground up and kind of reconfigure their notion of what is a civilization, what is a potential avatar for the player in this game. And, I think, like you suggested, choosing a Mughal leader or a leader that's not Gandhi would help to do that. It might help to start at that point and then maybe kind of rework some of this presentation of what is the Indian civilization after that point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and for me, as a historian who works on this period of transition from Mughal power to British power to the power of the nation state or nation states in the region, as it turns out, I can't help but see the fundamental story here as being about interaction between multiple forces that hinges ultimately on the question, who is Indian and what is India? And anytime I sit down to talk about or think about the history of the region, the power of the nation state, India, comes to expand its influence over the history of the region in a way that has the tendency to allow, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Bhutan to drop away. So when we talk about India, it's hard to remember that we're not just talking about the post-1947 nation state, but we're talking about a whole region, which was in very close contact with the regions that surrounded it. Obviously, the Himalayas provide a pretty significant border to the north, but India was connected across the Arabian Sea, across the Bay of Bengal, the Indian Ocean, the Hindu Kush, the deserts down in the south or the southwest. So choosing Gandhi reinforces that notion of a Hindu Indian nation state that's familiar to us now, and that then sheds some of that past without which India would not be what it is.
Yeah.
And even Gandhi would not be who he was.
100%.
If not for all that interaction.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great note to end on. Amber, thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Civs 101.
Thank you so much for having me, Bob. It's a pleasure.